The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Sometimes it's important to remember what COVID-19 has not resulted in. For example, food shortages. That's thanks to so many people along the supply chains, but it's especially thanks to Ontario's agricultural fortitude. Tonight, we'll hear how farmers stared down the past year of pandemic uncertainty. Also, as ROMA, the Rural Ontario Municipal Association, holds its annual conference, Nam Kiwanuka finds out about how to put people at the center of confronting poverty beyond urban Ontario. It's Monday, January 25th, and that's next on the agenda. Uncertainty is both the constant adversary and companion of those who till the land to feed us all. Last spring, that took the form of a pandemic that upended everything from labor supply to mismatches in supply and demand for agricultural products. With us now on how that's all unfolded over the year, and as is our custom, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with Sylvain Charlebois, Scientific Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. In the village of Annan, just outside Owen Sound, Ontario, Rob Lipsett, President of Beef Farmers of Ontario and a beef farmer himself. In Elora, Ontario, Mike Von Massow, food economist at the University of Guelph. And on her farm in the Holland Marsh in York Region, there's Avia Eek, a carrot and onion farmer and municipal councillor as well in the township of King. And it's great to welcome all of you onto TVO tonight. I want to start, Avia, get us started here. When it comes to farming, how would you describe the events of the past 10 months and what they've done to you?
To say that the challenges that our farming community faced would be an understatement. Whether it was coming down to, the big thing was labor and the uncertainty of whether we were going to have our labor in time for early spring planting. That was a big deal. So I know I only have 30 seconds, so I would say labor challenges and yeah, at the very beginning, because this was all new to all of us.
Okay, we'll dive in deeper as we continue our conversation. Rob, what would you add to that?
I would suggest that we felt a lot of uncertainty and a lot of volatility in our market. And as proactively as we tried to approach this when the pandemic was announced in March, it just seemed we were faced with one obstacle after the other and a lot of supply chain issues, both on our end and in our input end. Mike, over to you.
I think I'd echo what the people have already said. Just like the rest of us, farmers are people too, just like the rest of us, there was a certain amount of variability in the impact that was felt on the farm, depending on specifically what you were producing.
And Sylvain?
Well, generally, beyond labor, I think the labor issues were heavily publicized. The one thing that stood up to me is processing. The processing sector across the country was not ready for COVID, and farmers paid for it. There were huge disruptions, whether it's in livestock or in horticulture. It was very difficult for our farmers to cope with the shocks coming from processing.
Mike, let's follow up on the issue of food security, because when this pandemic started, I guess a lot of people had some reasonable questions about whether or not the food chain, the food supply, processing, the whole 9 yards, whether it could keep up and whether our supermarket shelves would continue to be stocked. What have you noticed over the past 10 months on that front?
Well, I think what we learned was that our food system is incredibly robust and resilient, notwithstanding some of the issues that Sylvain raised with the processing sector and that Avia raised relative to labor. We saw some disruption. We saw significant pain, I think, at the producer level when those beef processing plants closed. Those were an issue, particularly for producers, much less for consumers, because we have this integrated supply chain. So in terms of food availability, we did really well. I think what that does, though, is masks the significant food security impact that COVID has had, not in terms of availability, but in terms of all of the people who've lost work, who've seen income go down, and became food insecure because they couldn't afford food and not because they couldn't find food.
Right. Let's carry on that regard, because Sylvain, you led a team that basically looked at the pricing situation. You have over a number of years. You've got the 2021 edition of Canada's Food Price Report just out, and we want to take a look at some of what you are forecasting for the coming year. Canadians, you say, can expect to see an overall food price increase of 3 to 5% for the year 2021. The most significant increases are predicted for both meat and vegetables, and that gets you up 4.5% to 6.5% over last year. The annual food expenditure is estimated to be almost $700 higher, that's 5% higher, this year for, let's say, the average family of 4, and that is the highest forecasted increase since the start of this report more than a decade ago. Sylvain, just get us behind those numbers a little bit. How did you come to them?
Well, I mean, we do work with 3 other universities for this report, including Guelph, the University of Saskatchewan, and UBC in Vancouver. And we run different models, and our models were telling us a very, very dim story for this year for bakery, meat, and vegetables, unfortunately. Now, for Ontario specifically, the forecast is more around 3%, but keep in mind, Steve, that the general inflation rate is very low. So 3% will appear to be very high for people with tight budgets. I mean, food affordability is an issue across the country, including Ontario, unfortunately.
Could be twice the inflation rate, in other words.
If you look at the last 20 years, and it's in our report this year, if you look at the last 20 years, the food price index has outpaced the general price index across the country. And in Ontario specifically, the food index actually has outpaced the general inflation rate by 20 points, which means really that Ontarians are spending more money relative to their income right now compared to 20 years ago.
And one more fast follow-up with you, Sylvain. How often are you wrong on these prognostications?
Yeah, so over the last decade, so we started back in 2010, our accuracy rate is 85%. So we've been wrong, but not a whole lot. Gotcha.
Okay. Avia, why don't you come in here and tell us, in the course of doing what you do, have you had to charge more for your products?
Okay, so to put it all into context for your viewers, the price of food has gone up. I know I did an interview earlier last year with CTV, and they were asking about food shortages, and I said, well, it's really too early to tell, and it's too early to tell if the cost of food is going to be going up because it's all based on supply and demand. So in a normal non-COVID year, we have international trading partners. So if there's some kind of a weather issue here in Ontario or anywhere in Canada that's going to disrupt our fruit and vegetables, we have trading partners that we can generally count on to provide our residents with that food. In a year like 2020 with the pandemic, and it wasn't just Canada being impacted by this virus, it was all of our trading partners. So labor was an issue worldwide, not just here in Canada. As a result of that, there are some crops that some farmers worldwide, throughout Canada, throughout Ontario, chose. It's like, nope, that's too labor intensive. We don't have the labor force that we normally would have. We're going to switch crops, or we're going to switch, or we're not going to plant some acreage. So not all of the acreages got planted in the traditional ways that they would have been planted. So you have to look at it contextually. Number one, yields were down. We had a polar vortex go through right in spring. Then we had a heat wave. We didn't have our labor to help us with irrigating. Irrigating is a big deal. It's not just, you could do it alone, but it's very labor intensive. So you've got all these things coming against you. So if we got a rain, the crops could come back. Some of them did. We had yield shortages. So when it comes to food, the cost of food going up, if there's a demand for that food, and there is, we lost the processing sector. I know And on our farm, we grow carrots and onions. And on our farm, we generally grow, anywhere from 5 to 10 acres of jumbo carrots for the processing market. We lost money because that processing market was no longer available. And once you've got your seed, it's not like you can say, oh, well, you know what, we've got the jumbos, but we're not going to plant them. We planted them, we took a loss. That's the way the business goes.
Okay.
So to put it all into context, there's not the same crops being grown, and we can't count on our international partners. So yeah, the cost is gone up.
I totally appreciate that context. Rob, I wonder if you'd follow up on that by talking to us about what the cost of added COVID protocols might be on the typical farm and what that adds to the cost.
Yeah, I guess for beef, we're in a unique position where we're more price takers than price setters. So all these additional costs have just driven up our cost of production on the farm level. And so it's been a real combat for us that a lot of volatility and uncertainty where we have a product ready to go to market and we don't have the processing space available. So essentially we are working through a zero income, depending on loans and financing as much as possible to make it through to when we can actually get, per se, a paycheck.
I don't want to get too personal with you, but since you brought it up, what's your financial situation right now? You breaking even? You making any money? You losing money? Where are you at?
In the beef industry, we've traditionally been a low profit margin industry. So break even in some sectors of the industry is good. We're broken down into cow-calf producers, backgrounders, and then the feedlot operations that do the final finishing of the beef product. So through the various sectors, it's a little different. The cow-calf operators, which I have struggled a little bit just due to the trickle-down effect of our industry where cattle at the end of the line aren't moving, which reduces the amount of sales that occur at my end. So personally, I'd say break even is a positive outlook for the 2020 year, and it looks like we may hit that break even level.
And what about the cost of delays? How do you figure that in?
It's one of those things in our industry that you can't put a price on. I know a lot of people have talked to me about the supply chain for our parts and our feed inventory and just the lack of availability of parts to keep your tractor running or feed to feed your animals and delays in getting it there. And you really can't put a price on that, except for at the feedlot level, where if you have an animal that's ready to go and you're forced to hold on to it for an extra period of time, the average cost of that is $4 per head per day. So after a month's time, you've got $120 extra added expense to that animal. And when you work on an average of profit of $55 per head, there's going to be a lot of people struggling to make it through this.
Right. Mike, pick up the story if you would. Consumers, what might they be noticing that's different with the shopping experience?
Well, I think Sylvain highlighted that we've seen some price increases. We expect to see more in price increases. We saw some specific COVID-related price increases. And one of the ironies is, while the beef producers were seeing decreased returns, when some of those plants were closed in June, we saw some higher than normal price increases for beef in the summer. So we're seeing kind of the irony of consumers having to pay a bit more while producers were getting paid a little less. But the other thing that I think we've seen throughout COVID is a reduction in choice, that as demand went up at retail, which it did, restaurants closed to a significant degree and have been slow to come back. Companies withdrew some of those slower moving or lower volume stock keeping units, SKUs. And so we saw and continue to see a little bit less choice on the supermarket shelves. So where we think we might be short some things, we're not really short, we're just seeing fewer options. And a perfect example, I've become one of those COVID bakers, and you can't get multigrain flour because it was a slower mover, and the companies have focused on those high volume products.
When you say you're a COVID baker, do you mean professionally or just for fun at home?
Just for fun at home. I'm one of those people who started to bake bread, and at our house we haven't bought bread since the middle of April, just because we're stuck at home. It's a nice diversion from sitting in front of a camera and talking to students.
You getting good at it? Baking the bread, I mean?
I don't mean to brag, but I think I'm getting pretty good at it. So I've got a couple of really good recipes.
Good for
and
you.
Good local flour here in Fergus, too.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Sylvain, when prices go up, and you're forecasting that they will above the rate of inflation, maybe significantly above the rate of inflation for those of us in Ontario, what do consumers do typically?
Well, so yeah, there's nothing wrong with food inflation. It's when food inflation exceeds the general inflation rate that it becomes a problem. I would say, really, in grocery stores, you should expect, as Mike said, there are going to be fewer choices. Right now, most grocers are revisiting their portfolio of brands. You should expect more private labels because people are going to be trading down. Private labels tend to be cheaper, and what I mean by private labels, President's Choice, Compliments, No Name, those are the brands that you probably will likely see more often now. The other thing, Steve, that we have to remind ourselves is that the supply chain is becoming way more open. Everyone wants to do business online now. Everyone is selling to the consumer directly. Even farmers, 5% of all sales right now conducted online when it comes to food, it's food sold by farmers or farmers markets right now in the country.
Does any of that violate any marketing board treaties that are in place?
Good question. No, they're being very careful. Obviously, within your own province, you can sell freely, no problem. When it comes to alcohol, dairy, other things, other issues come up. But right now, people are being very careful.
Gotcha. Rob, how about Ontario beef in Japan? I know our wares are very popular in Japan. Did that help at all during the course of the pandemic?
For Ontario beef, the Japan market really has carried us through the pandemic. We've made some really good inroads in the last 2 years in Japan. We lost the restaurant business as we did here in Ontario through the pandemic, but the retail really picked up. And Japan never really backed off the amount of Ontario beef they had imported. So where we lost some other markets, the uptick in sourcing local Ontario-grown beef and the export to Japan has really floated us through this. So we're looking forward to getting through the pandemic and seeing if we can't increase that Japan market even more.
So just so I understand the significance of it, would you say it kind of saved your year, the fact that Japan was there?
I think it will have saved our year, and probably the biggest point of that is there are more retail outlets in Japan selling Ontario beef brands than there are in the province of Ontario right now. So we have a little more work to do here at home to ramp up our local product, but Japan certainly has been a savior for us.
Okay, let's have some discussion here about one of the issues that gets quite a great deal of attention in the news media, and that is the issue of migrant workers and the challenges that presents. And Avia, I'm going to bring you in to start with because, well, give us a sense of how it plays out on your farm, the whole issue of migrant workers.
Okay, we've been part of the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program since 1998. We tried for 5 years prior to that to hire locally, and with dismal results. I mean, sometimes people would show up, sometimes they wouldn't, or they could only work a few hours. It was too hot, blah, blah, blah. So in 1998, we started with the program. It's been very successful. It's kind of like a foreign aid program. These people can't get jobs in their own countries. They come up here and they help provide our Canadians with cheap food because we have a contract. Canada has a contract with the source countries, and those contracts are adhered to. So back to, we'll push it forward now to 2020. We do our labor market impact assessment. We put our ads out advertising for Canadian workers. That has to be done as part of the LEMA process. And it's a 13-page application. It has to be done every year. And as if circumstances are going to change. But anyway, I call it an exercise in futility, but that's me. And so, as an example, in 2019, I didn't get any responses from any Canadians asking for a job in 2020 when I advertised. So my application went through and that was fine. I had asked that our workers come. We get 3 workers from Trinidad, and one gentleman has been with us 10 years, 11 years. And the other gentleman's been with us 6 years. It was the first year for one of the new workers. And so we request them to come up the end of April so we can do our onion transplanting. We purchase thousands of dollars of seed. We send it down to Keller Brothers in Beamsville. They grow it in their greenhouses. The seedlings get shipped up to us. We did 12 acres of yellow cooking onions and red onions. So, and the reason why you want to do an early market is because there's that window between the fresh in America and the US, which is our main trading partner, and Canada. So there's a little window, 2 to 3 week window, where you have an opportunity to make some extra money because it's fresh market.
Gotcha. Avia, how many? I think you called them seasonal agricultural workers. Some people call them migrant workers, whatever. How many do you have in total there?
We have 3. So back to your question, because I know I tend to ramble. I'm passionate about this. And so they were supposed to come up April 29, and Trinidad was not letting people out of their country. Canada had lifted the exemption for travel to allow the workers to come up from other countries. And we didn't get our first guy till July 6th. So, and then the other 2 we didn't get till mid-August. We had to transplant, and there's, my husband and I can't do it ourselves. It's been 6 years since I sat on a transplanter. So we went through this agency. We got local people, because there was that hue and cry, hire local people that are on unemployment insurance. And I guess some people have this notion that agriculture is mindless. There's no skill involved. While the SOP program, Seasonal Agriculture Workers Program, is a low-skilled program, there is a level of skill required. And you can't just pull somebody off the street who's on EI and say, hey, come and work on my farm. There's training that has to take place. And when the people are being switched out every 2 to 3 days over a 2-week period, it gets really tiring. And you're constantly having to retrain people every other day, and they just don't have the investment.
Let me see if I can give people a sense. I appreciate that look at your farm in particular, but I want to give people a sense of the way it looks all across the province. According to Public Health Ontario, there were COVID outbreaks at 30 of the province's farms between April and mid-October, which, of course, as you just indicated, is when seasonal workers started to go home. Can I just check, have you had any outbreaks on your farm, Avia?
No, we only have 3. Okay, so again, I'm going to give some context here, because when COVID first became a thing, we set up an account with Gordon Food Service. I was not going to let my 3 workers off the farm. Like, we have 5 different locations, but I was not going to let them go into town to go shopping. And I wanted to keep our bubble. And then we were told, no, you can't do that. So imagine, it's hard to contain 3 people. Imagine some of these farmers, these larger farmers in southwestern Ontario, where there were, 50 plus workers.
Well, that's it. Let me pick up on that, because you've put your finger on a big question here. Because, of course, during that same period, spring to fall, more than 1,300 migrant workers apparently tested positive for COVID, and that's about 5% of Ontario's farm worker population. That's 10 times what the regular positivity rate is during the same period. I got a little quote here from somebody. This is from the CBC's Fifth Estate. They spoke to one migrant worker who came to Southern Ontario from Jamaica, and here's how he described his experience on this farm that grows fruits and vegetables. He said, honestly, it feels like I'm in a prison. We're allowed to go out 2 to 3 hours every 2 weeks, only on our shopping days to get our food. That's the only time we can leave. If we leave and the owner sees us leaving, anything like that, then the first thing he would want is to send us home. And this worker was expected to work up to 17 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. Okay, how does that compare with your situation, Avia?
Our workers work 10 hours a day, but I understand where the workers coming from, because they feel their freedoms are being taken away. Let's face it, through this pandemic, all our freedoms have been taken away. When it comes to a farm operation, my husband and I are working with our workers. If they go off and do something, if they don't take it quite as seriously as we take it, they come back and infect us. My husband gets sick and dies. There's our farm gone. So it's not just, these are very different, there's extenuating circumstances. In a normal year, non-pandemic year, these guys can come and go as they please. They have all the freedoms in the world. Their off time is their off time. There's a contract. They have to work so many hours. They're here to work. If on our farm, our guys work 10 hours a day. If they choose, and they get Sundays off, if they choose to work on a Sunday, because they want the money, we're not going to say no to them. But we constantly, when they came up, I gave them a booklet. We had a conversation with them, making them understand the dire consequences, what can happen if they don't listen and take this seriously.
No, I totally appreciate that. Let me move it over to Rob here. Give us the 411 on how it works in the beef industry.
Sure. For the most part, Ontario's beef farms are family-run operations, and very few operations access migrant workers for on-farm work. But where migrant workers are important to our industry is that's what fills most of our processing facilities with labor. So we've seen, prior to the pandemic, we saw quite a few of our processing plants close down, and they cited that labor challenges and access to workforce were one of the biggest problems. And we've just seen that amplify with the COVID-19 issue, that when plants closed, we didn't have any extra workers to bring in to pick up that slack, and that's where it's affected us on the farmer level.
How about on your farm? Do you have any migrant workers there?
No, just myself, my father, and my brother-in-law run our smaller size family operation.
You guys all getting along okay these days?
We tend to get along pretty well. We understand that when you're this close, both working relationship and blood relationship, that you just have to be careful what you say and how you conduct yourself.
That may go for every business these days and every family these days as well. Sylvain, come on in and tell us, in your view, do you think Canada's food distribution, food processing, agricultural system is too dependent on migrant workers? What do you think?
I would say this, we look at the entire country, and something happened in Ontario that was quite unusual. I personally think that farmers were unfairly targeted with the situation with migrant workers. Farmers were doing their best to protect them, and as Avia said, most of our freedoms were taken away with COVID. It's not because of what was going on farms, and there's a huge misunderstanding of what farming is all about. Farming, I worked on farms when I was a kid. It's a lot of work. It's tough work, and it's not easy. And so I think there's a case to be made for migrant workers in our ag economy. And with COVID, it made it obvious that a lot of people just misunderstand their role specifically on farms.
Mike, what would you add to that?
Well, I think there's something that we need to recognize, and I'm not blaming anyone in the food system, but one of the costs of relatively cheap food, Canada, notwithstanding some of the price increases that Sylvain is talking about, which are real and are outpacing the rate of inflation, the truth is that the cost of cheap food is relatively low wages throughout the food system, whether you're working in a kitchen at a restaurant, whether you're working stocking shelves in a grocery store, or whether you're working in a beef processing plant. We're not paying people very much. And so it's not anybody's fault. I'm not trying to point any fingers here, but the truth is that because we have cheap food, we can't afford to pay people throughout the system. And I think that that's something we need to take a long and hard look at, because we've highlighted the challenges with resilience when problems occur.
How would you see that happening, Mike?
How would I see that happening? I think what we need to do is come up with ways to reflect the actual value that we are producing. And that might mean continuing to have higher prices for food in order that we can pay people in restaurants a living wage, in order that we can pay people in grocery stores a living wage, in order that we can, and it's not, oh, let's point fingers at the beef farmers or let's point fingers at the beef processors. The market is establishing what those margins are, and I think we need to face the fact that we're probably not paying enough for food.
Sylvain, you wanted to add?
Migrant workers aren't necessarily cheap, by the way. They're paid well. The irony of it all is that we've seen more innovation at Farmgate in the last 30 years than in food retail. And in retail, of course, a lot of people are underpaid. which is really the big problem. CEOs are getting huge bonuses, and most workers in grocery stores are earning a very low wage. That's the problem that I think that Mike is pointing to, and that needs to be resolved. And yes, food affordability is going to become an issue, but at some point we're going to think about what kind of food system we need to provide good quality food to people so they can eat. But at the same time, how can people make a good living and make the food industry more attractive from farm to fork?
Well, Sylvain, let me just do a quick follow with you. I mean, we have a minimum wage in the province of Ontario. I think it's 14.25 an hour. Is there an exemption for migrant workers to that, or do they have to get minimum wage?
On farm?
Yeah.
Well, actually, my guess that the minimum wage would apply, but they earn way more. In Nova Scotia here, the average salary in horticulture is about $18 to $19 an hour.
Avia, I say you nodding your head there. You pay minimum wage?
Actually, it just went up January 1st, so it's $14.39. But add into that the cost of housing. We provide housing free. Our workers live in a 3-bedroom house. They each have their own bedroom. It's a beautiful little house. So there's the cost of the housing, the utilities we pay for. All they pay for is their food. So if you factor in, and then the fact that we pay part of their flight up here and part of their flight home, if you were to factor all that in, yeah, we could probably afford to pay somebody like maybe $18 or $19 an hour. But again, who wants to work 10 hours a day from the cold spring to the cold fall till mid-November for even that kind of money? People do not want to do that. They don't want to do those jobs. So yeah.
When you say people, you mean people born in Ontario. Okay, let's. I got a few minutes left here, so let me touch on one more thing here. The Ontario Federation of Agriculture, they do surveys throughout the pandemic. Last one came out in October, 700 responses almost, and here were their top concerns. 60%, not surprisingly, worried about a global recession. 55% concerned about the financial impact on their farm. 52% citing trade and supply chain issues. Those were the top three. But when asked about mental health, this was interesting. 59%, almost 6 in 10, mentioned feeling more stress due to COVID-19. Rob, do those numbers resonate with you?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was surprised by any of the numbers that were put up there. That the volatility and the uncertainty is certainly weighing on primary producers. At the Beef Farmers of Ontario, just before the pandemic hit, we started with some mental health well-being seminars and encouraging our members to reach out. And we really ramped that up throughout the pandemic as we noticed people were starting to feel stressors that they had never felt before. And recognizing that farmers consider themselves strong and resilient, we're maybe a little reluctant to reach out for help. And right now, I'd say one of our major concerns is the mental health well-being of our membership. So although that number came in right around all the rest, I'd put more emphasis on encouraging farmers to swallow their pride, for lack of better terms, and reach out should they feel something strange within themselves, or if they notice it within a friend or a neighbor or family member. Just acknowledge that and offer some help. We have a lot of resources available through our organization and all the agriculture organizations. And there's even the agriculture mental health helpline that can be called for discreet conversation and venting. So I'd encourage everyone to reach out should they feel the need.
Gotcha. Avia, what do you think needs to happen to get things back to quote unquote normal for this farming season?
Well, you know what, and I guess I have a different view of the whole thing. Other than the labor issue, we're still, like, we sold all our crop. It was still, our crop was still in the barn. My husband was still selling carrots and onions when COVID broke out. So we still moved our product. We got paid very well. Where we went through, the labor was the issue. Stress was caused because we didn't have labor when we needed it. We didn't have reliable help even when we went through agencies. Weeds grew. We had yield reductions. We had weather against us. But at the end of the day, we harvested our crop and it's in the barn and we've been getting paid very well. We've seen prices that we don't normally see, and this is a terrible thing to say, but I've always said, I've been married to Bill for 32 years. He's third generation farmer. We make money when there's catastrophe with one of our trading partners. Unfortunately, the pandemic has created a level of catastrophe, not a level, that would be an understatement, but it has created a catastrophe. So because food supplies are down, the cost is going up. So from our perspective, it's business as usual for us, and our workers, Trinidad wasn't letting them go home in the fall. So our guys are still here. So worrying about spring planting, we're going to be right on schedule this year.
I bet you, though, Mother Nature's always on schedule, her own. But I bet you everybody's going to be a lot happier once, well, you know what goes into the arm. I want to thank Sylvain Charlebois from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Rob Lipset from Annan, Ontario, Mike Van Massow from the University of Guelph, he's in Elora, Avia Eek, the carrot and onion farmer in the Holland Marsh. It's great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Hang in there, everybody.
Thank you again, Steve, for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Stay well.
In urban environments, poverty and homelessness can be evident at street level, but in rural Ontario, those facing tough times can be much harder to see. COVID-19 has made that more difficult and essential to address, as the gaps between services and people can be life-altering. Joining us now as part of our collaboration with the Rural Ontario Municipal Association during their 2021 annual conference in the provincial capital, Elizabeth McIsaac, president of Maitri, a charitable foundation focused on human rights and poverty in Canada. Welcome. It's very nice to meet you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
I mean, what a year it's been. You know, for months, there's been a lot of talk about post-pandemic economic recovery. What do you feel has been missing from that conversation?
Well, I think we're so caught up with where we are at the moment. I think there are certainly I think of economists like Armin Yalnizyan, who has so very rightly talked about a she-covery and coined that phrase. And I think what's important about that is really drawing our attention to those who have been most impacted, most severely impacted, and those who were already in a position of vulnerability, of difficulty in terms of precarity of work, underpaid work conditions, and those types of things going into the pandemic. And so, I mean, it's become, I think, almost cliche at this point that we talk about the COVID has, put all of the cracks in our system under a spotlight, and has revealed just how bad things are. But what we really need to talk about, and again, we've said it over and over, let's build back better. But what does that mean, and what is that actually going to take? And I think that's where we really need to get into. What does that involve? What are the values that are implied in that? And how do we guide that? How do we govern that process of building back better so that we don't just repeat the same things? Because the decisions we've made in public policy have been guided by certain imperatives and pressures. And so I think really being conscious of what values we want to guide recovery will be critical.
And we're going to talk more about building back better and what that entails. But you don't think that we need to divorce economic recovery and human recovery. Is that correct?
I think they're hand in hand. I think that as we talk about as we talk about economic recovery, we're going to see investments. We're going to see significant investments once we start to see stimulus funds flowing. And that's going to be once we get over this hump. We're still in the middle of things. But when that happens, when we stimulate the economy, we need to do it in such a way that people are getting the jobs in the kinds of jobs that they're able to do, that they're going to have training to do, that those are going to be jobs that have decent conditions attached to them. So we've made, some fatal errors in our economy around precarious work, and we've seen the fallout from that. We've seen the fallout from not giving people sick days. We've seen the fallout from not paying people enough so that they have security. And so as we think about the new jobs that are coming and how we're going to shape that, that has to be part and parcel of the conversation.
What is a human rights-based approach to recovery?
So this is work that we've been doing. I'm at a private foundation that is interested in poverty and human rights. And so we've recently been thinking about what does a human rights community, a human rights city, and we're talking about rural Ontario. So what does it mean for local government when we think about human rights? And a human rights recovery for us is really about the planning, the decision making that is going to happen, the priorities that are going to be set, and using a human rights lens for that. And I'm not just talking about non-discrimination, although that is paramount and so important, but it's also about the realization of social and economic rights. Are we ensuring that we are providing access to affordable housing? Are we providing jobs that have decent work conditions? Are we, all those social and economic rights, work, health, education, housing, food security, how are those being planned for at a local level, and that we're building people who are going to be impacted by it into the decision making? Really key. Are people who are impacted involved?
I think it's safe to say that when we think about human rights, oftentimes we think of it through the lens of federal government and maybe not municipalities. In what ways are local governments positioned to advocate for those rights?
So local governments make a lot of decisions that impact people's lives. And in fact, many of our rights are realized or not realized or violated at a local level. It's things like housing, it's affordable housing. It is food security. These things happen in our communities, in our towns, our cities, our communities. And local governments have a whole bunch of tools available to them. They are making decisions all the time, whether it's in designing buildings, in investing. They're going to be getting infrastructure dollars coming down from the federal government. How is that going to be deployed? How do they do procurement of services? Are they attaching to the procurement of services that the city or the town commissions? Are they putting attached to that human rights conditions? They have the ability to affect all kinds of planning and design decisions using a human rights approach. They're also closest to the people. They're not just social actors. They're not just economic actors locally. They're also democratic actors. So the extent to which they are bringing the community, the local residents, into decision making is part of this.
So when we think about how this human rights approach might work, let's talk about rural Ontario and an example of migrant workers. What sort of conditions have some of these workers in southwestern Ontario been dealing with during this pandemic?
So we all saw the news over the course of the summer and into the fall of migrant workers who, one, were in living conditions that were far below what anyone would feel comfortable seeing their own family living in. We saw workers that were not being allowed to leave the farm. They had different, perhaps, mobility rights being given to them by their employers. We saw workers who were afraid to speak out because their work is contingent on the employer that they're working for. So there's a built-in power relationship where it's very difficult for them to claim their rights, to speak out about things. We also saw 30 outbreaks on some of the farms across Ontario. So it was really a terrible tragedy of how that played out for these workers who are very vulnerable in terms of their rights. And I think that this is a great example of it takes all orders of government to find solutions on this, because this is a program designed by the federal government. There's levels of provincial regulation involved in it, and then there's local communities who are dealing with the fallout of it. And the impact of it. And then there's the private sector, the farmers themselves. And so that's an example where there was a number of different players. The ones who had no voice were the workers themselves. And so that's the opposite of human rights approach.
Do you think that part of what's missing is the education component of people knowing what their rights are?
That's a big part of it. When we talk about a rights-based approach, we talk about promoting human rights, which is about ensuring that people are educated about it, understand what their rights are. But you also need to have places where they can claim those rights, where they can come forward and raise issues. And if that's not in place, then the other is meaningless. But we also talk about protecting human rights, which is the duty on the part of government to ensure that another actor, a business, a private sector or other, isn't violating the rights of a person. And then there's also the third part, which is the obligation of states to fulfill, to ensure that their rights are being realized. And that's where the government has to come in and do their part to make sure that the workers' rights are being protected and realized.
So moving forward, how could a human rights-based approach change the working conditions for migrant workers?
I think that goes back into the policy design of how we're looking at temporary foreign workers, of seasonal workers that are coming into Canada. I think there's been, and this is another example of, a policy that has been challenged for being flawed in terms of the rights that workers have for many years. It's not new. It's been decades that we've had this program in place. It's decades of insufficient housing arrangements being provided, insufficient inspection, insufficient rights, where a worker can be sent back if they're fired by their employer because they are entirely subject to that employer. So great vulnerability. So it goes back up into the policy. How are we going to do that policy? And I think the federal government has work to do there. And I think that local governments can be really important advocates, both around the importance of these farmers being supported to increase the quality of what they are offering their workers, also holding employers to account, but ensuring that, and there was an example, I think, of one mayor in might have been Norfolk County, but really spoke out about the impact this has on the community, that people were looking at, migrant workers and with fear that they were carrying the virus. Well, they were like everybody else, but it sparks the wrong reaction. And so the leadership, I think, from mayors, from political leaders in our local communities is so important to set the tone that these are human rights, that we respect that.
We're living in such a strange time, and there's so many industries that are competing with one another for resources. Do you worry that people might hear human rights and then dismiss it as being too idealistic of an approach?
I think people do get their backs up when you talk about human rights. So people are claiming things, and all of a sudden, do I have to give everybody a job? Does everybody get a house? And that's actually not what it's about. And so we do have a lot of education to do around this. When we talk about a human rights approach, it's about putting people at the center. It's recognizing what rights of theirs a policy needs to address, that the goal needs to be. How are we going to move the marker forward? It's something called progressive realization, that we're going to continue moving forward, but measure ourselves against it and ensure and be accountable to seeing things go forward, not backward. That's what we mean by it. And so I don't think there's something to be afraid of. In fact, I think there's something to embrace, because when we do it, and when we do it right, we actually end up having better outcomes, and we'll end up having communities with greater resilience, less homelessness, better economic productivity, and less cost to public services, because people will be able to find economic opportunity. They'll be housed. We'll have a different set of engagement by people in the community, as opposed to being pushed out. And we know this. We know that when people are on the outside, it creates negative impact right around. And so it is in everyone's best interest, in fact, to see this.
Well, the pandemic has exposed a lot of things in society that have been there, but maybe we didn't want to look at before. And now we're forced to look at. The Liberal government has vowed to build back better, and you mentioned that earlier. What other groups do we need to pay attention to, especially in rural Ontario, if we're going to build back better?
So I think there's the usual groups of people who are excluded, who have not had the benefit of what society is offering. So I think women are a big group. We know that they are disproportionately impacted in the workplace, and so they are a group that needs to be considered. And I think that some of the work that has happened around that is really important. I think people with that are working for accessibility, whose disabilities perhaps prevent them from gaining access to some of the opportunities that they should have access to, are a group we really need to be attentive to, because that is another example of a group that was disproportionately impacted by COVID, and we want to make sure that we don't repeat that in the build back. We know that racialized communities have been significantly impacted. I live in Toronto, but it's not just a Toronto issue. The Black community was significantly impacted, not only by COVID, but also by other issues of anti-Black racism in the community. And so all of these communities have to be at top of mind, Indigenous communities top of mind, as we build back, that we're building a community and a society that is respectful of all. And so I also think of groups like those who are currently without homes, the homelessness, and that is across Ontario. That is in small town, big city. Homelessness is part of our reality. And so how do we ensure that the build back is ensuring access to affordable housing, that we're building affordable housing, and that people have access to it?
When the Ontario government issued its latest preventative measures to try and contain the spread of COVID-19, it was criticized for not including sick days for employees as part of its plan. How could the omission of sick days affect the province's recovery efforts?
I mean, we're seeing it now. I mean, the fact that the spread of the virus is I think it's kind of accepted. This is a direct result and impact of people not being able to call in sick, and those who don't have sick days. And let's be clear, there are certain jobs where you have sick days, and there are certain jobs where you don't. And so, by allowing part of the sector of the employment sector to not provide sick days, to not allow people to have that time to, if they're sick, to isolate, to take care of themselves, people have really compelling reasons to show up for work. It's rent, it's food on the table, it's their children in front of them. And so unless we work together, and I think there's ideas that are moving around about government working with private sector to figure out how that happens, both in the short term, but then let's build it into longer term public policy that is sustainable, that will protect workers in an ongoing way. Until and unless we have that, we will simply be vulnerable to the same results again. Would you argue that sick days should be considered a human rights? I believe they are part of the right to work. Right to work includes decent work. The International Labour Organization has dug into this. There are all kinds of things around fair wages, and sick days being part of that. We need to be able to call in sick. The remuneration is up to be figured out and negotiated. But protecting the job and having some payment there to allow people to call in sick. I think if there's one takeaway from this pandemic, that's got to be it. If you were to lay out a human-centered pandemic recovery plan for rural Ontario, what would the priorities be? So I would, with priorities, I always think of what's available, what's under your jurisdiction, what do local authorities have available to them, and I think that they're the things that we've talked a little bit about, and as the build back for local communities comes, there will be investments being made. Use the tools they have, and so I think that things like using social procurement, there will be, if money is coming in for infrastructure projects, look at how to do community benefits. Look at how you. What do you mean by that? Community benefits, sorry. So community benefit agreements are something that have begun to be used around big infrastructure programs, around projects, both in the U.S., in Canada, and more broadly. And what it does is communities come together to define the outcomes, the social benefits that they want for the community. So that if you're building a football stadium, if you're building a hockey arena, if you are building a new bridge, what are the benefits that are going to come with that? Because that's a lot of money coming into the community. Is it going to move out across? Who's getting the jobs? What kind of training is available for those jobs? Are there other built environment things that will come from that you can negotiate in as part of the deal? Private sector contractors are going to make a lot of money from this. So what are the benefits that are going to reside in the community and stay in the community? And that's what you negotiate through a community benefit agreement. And so I think that that's a tool that local municipalities should look at. Local municipalities have lots of control over all kinds of procurement. Let's make sure that that those companies that you're hiring to do work for you are paying people a fair wage, are providing sick days, are applying a human rights lens, are ensuring that there is equity and inclusion across and non-discrimination. So those are pieces that cities have control over. But I think the first step, cities, communities, towns, there's an opportunity to state, to formally recognize what are the values that are going to guide our process. What are we going to be a human rights community, and how do we recognize that? Do we have an articulated statement of what that means for us, and then what is our plan to achieve it?
And I think for a lot of people who live in urban areas, when they hear rural community, they assume it's just one community. How important is it when we do have these discussions for us to acknowledge the diversity in those rural communities?
It's critical, and that's why I can't lay out a single roadmap of this is what it looks like or what are the priorities, because every community needs to do that inward look of what are the priorities in our community. Is it our relationships with surrounding Indigenous communities to this local municipality? Do we have real resource or resource extraction issues in our community, and how do we manage that? Are we a conduit to an international border, and what does that mean for the work we do? Are we a farming community? Are we surrounded by, and what does that mean for our priorities? So it does have to be very, I think, specific to the location, but the principles and the tools, I think, are very generalizable.
So when we talk about the recovery priorities, who needs to be working together and how to tackle this?
So beginning from the community itself, I think that the leadership comes from the political leadership. I think that if this is a priority for them, there needs to be a political statement around that, a recognition that these are the values that are going to guide us. There's going to be pressure. And we know this is coming. We know that in the next 10 years, we're going to see austerity measures. We have spent a lot of money as a country in the last 10 months. We're going to spend more in the coming year. And then there's going to be, we know that that's coming down the road. And so I think the pushback has to be, what are the values that are guiding us? Are we being guided by fiscal imperatives, by balancing budgets at certain timelines? Are we being guided by the most important thing, which is the human dignity of each person in our community? And how do we move the marker toward that?
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your insights. Thank you for being on the agenda.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And that is the agenda for Monday, January 25th, 2021. And can we note that yesterday we lost the last man to hoist the Stanley Cup as captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Rest in peace, George Armstrong, who died at age 90. Now, continuing our collaboration with the Rural Ontario Municipal Association, tomorrow we'll speak to the federal minister responsible for rural economic development, that's Mariam Monsef. Also, we'll get a sense of how COVID-19 has altered life in Ontario outside the major urban areas. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.